Hello, P Street family, and whoever else might be joining us that, may not be connected to Pulaski Street as far as being a part of the church family here, but you like to listen in, join us each week, either live or the recording. And so, hey, thanks for taking the time. Obviously, it's hoped that something that's said, something we emphasize, challenges you in some way, helps you in some way. And if you got questions, don't hesitate to ask them. You can Facebook message me. You can drop them in the comment section. It's whatever. A couple of things before we get into our lesson for tonight. I know that what I'm about to talk about will become obsolete by this time next week. And so there'll be this recording of these announcements. But a couple of things we mentioned this morning. Come this Wednesday, September the 30th, starting at about 4:30, we're going to start serving chili pies, or folks can come by at Ingram Sal Elementary School and purchase a chili pie to enjoy, and all the proceeds are going to go to help out Ingram Sal. And so we're the ones that are, Pulaski Street is the ones handling that booth and basically taking ownership of it. And several of you, and we're thankful for this, said, hey, we're going to make you some chili. I do have a recipe. And so if you want to use it, you can. It's evidently good for chili pies. I got it from my wife, and so who might have got it from somebody else. But we're not saying you have to use it, but we will pass it along to you. If anything, if we all use the same recipe and we all do well using the recipe, we'll have some consistency when it comes to what we're serving as far as chili is concerned. But you might have a lot of confidence in your chili. And so if you do, hey, go for it. Come Saturday, this Saturday, and I believe that is October the 3rd, from about 8 o'clock in the morning to noon. Please, if you're able, come by the church building here, and we got a lot of cleaning to do in the education wing. I've been under a lot of construction. That's kind of been, if you're looking for a silver lining with the pandemic, it has allowed us to make some huge strides on renovating things back there. There's still more to do, mind you, but we're going to need a little help getting things ready to go for October 7th, that Wednesday night when we resume our classes. So if you can, come, for an hour, 2 hours. If you can stay for 4, that's great. I'm hoping to be able to help out the last couple hours of the morning. But that's a couple of things I want to emphasize again. Make sure is coming up, and it's a couple of ways you can be of service. Speaking of service, that's what we're talking about. We talked about it last week, and we're going to talk about it again this week, and then that'll be that'll finish our discussion of service, and we'll move on to the concept of stewardship. Again, these are holy habits. These are spiritual disciplines that we are looking to develop in our lives, to make more consistent in our lives, because these are means for us to become more and more like Jesus, which I would argue, which we argued this when we first started this series, is sort of the ultimate goal that God has for his people, is to become like his son, to be, in the end, for instance, or especially, conformed to the image of his son. Romans 8, verse 29. But there's a process, 2 Corinthians 3:18, that we are engaged in, and these are some things that we can do that will help us in our cooperation with God to become like his son. So, with that, let's kind of do a little review here of what we said last week. You're looking at Mark 10:45. This is perhaps the most concise summation of Jesus's ministry, and it came from his own mouth. He said, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." And the word here that Jesus used for served, this is even outside the New Testament in secular Greek. It was a word that generally referred to one serving another as a waiter or a taster or a caregiver. In general, it referred to someone who served the interests of others. Diakoneo. Now, the noun form is the word from which we get deacon, which is used, in a specialized sense, for instance, in 1 Timothy chapter 3. But in Greek eyes, serving was not very dignified. Ruling and not serving was considered to be proper to a man. The formula of the sophist is, how can a man be happy when he has to serve someone? That expressed the basic attitude of the Greeks. But here's Jesus, who was the King of Kings, is the King of Kings, and he applied the concept of service to himself, which makes for an incredible thought. Jesus did not merely bring about a radical change in the academic estimation of human existence and action. He instituted a new pattern of relationships, one predicated on serving others. And so last week we really emphasized that here is Jesus, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, our Master, our Teacher, who served. And if our Lord is all about service, then we have no excuse for not being about service as well. And so we really dove into that, looking at his example and the pattern that he left for us. And then here we are looking to follow in his footsteps and to serve others. What we're going to do today in this lesson is we're gonna look at a passage, Galatians 5, 13 and 14. So go ahead and be turning, if you got your Bible out, hopefully you do. You can be turning over there, and we're about to bring that up in just a minute here. But we're going to make a couple observations about Galatians 5. And then I'm going to offer some simple, practical advice about serving others. Not going to be, it's kind of like some things you can do or be mindful of. And some of these are interesting because you often probably wouldn't categorize some of these as serving others, but you are. And I'm looking at it in terms of small, simple things, and you'll see what we're emphasizing there. And then we will close with, I think, a thought that should motivate us to keep on keeping on when it comes to serving others, and certainly practicing the spiritual discipline, the holy habit of service. So here is the passage in Galatians 5, 13, 14. "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, what I want to do is I want to make highlight a couple of things from here. I'm indebted to Dan Winkler for these two thoughts, but here is the first point that we would want to make based on Galatians 5, and you kind of see we'll look at some other parts of this chapter as we use Galatians 5, 13, and 14 as our launching pad. Here's the first thing. Love for God is that from which we serve. It's like the ultimate motivation. It's the sort of the source of our service. The text, and that's kind of why I wanted you to have in front of you so I don't have to keep, I guess I could on this go back and forth. But the text says you were called to freedom, brothers. The idea is that we have been called over to freedom. Winkler, he gave the illustration of the old Red Rover, let so-and-so come over. And if you heard your name, you ran to those who called you, try to break their hands. If you did, you could take one back. If not, you had to stay on that side. But there's this idea of being called over. We've been called over to the side of freedom. Galatians 5:1, for instance, this same chapter said, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." It's in this fear of freedom that we serve. Now, how exactly does that connect to this idea of love for God? Well, even there you see this yoke of slavery. We don't serve because we are afraid of God, afraid of being condemned for failing to obey Him perfectly. That is a law system, like the Old Testament. If you were going to be justified, let's say if you were going to be justified by law and works, then to be justified by law and works would require perfectly keeping the law in all its points without failure. And on that basis, you could be justified. But the problem is, and I think we all know this, we cannot be perfect in our obedience. Galatians 3:10, "For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them." Those of us who try to live with that kind of mindset of establishing, as it were, our own righteousness through perfect law keeping, we're severed from Christ. As Paul would actually go on to say there in Galatians chapter 4, "You who would be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace." We have been called over to something better. Paul refers to it as freedom. Hebrews 8 verse 6, "But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises." We have been called to a quote-unquote religion that is driven by our relationship with God, our love for God. We do not serve God because we are afraid of God, per se. We serve God because we appreciate Him and we love Him, and we are free to serve Him without fear of condemnation if we don't do everything perfectly all the time. Walking in the light, and I've made this point in several sermons, walking in the light is not sinless perfection. It's not. Where that is found, that language is found in 1 John, as we walk in the light, He is able to cleanse us, continually cleanse us of what? Our sin. This doesn't mean that we want to sin and that we are just going to live as heathens and thumb our nose at God and His Word and His will. It's not that we want to sin, but we do have weaknesses. And God has made provision for those weaknesses as we seek to become more and more like His Son. It's more about direction than perfection. And in that direction, we are to become more humble, more lowly, more servant-minded. And we serve. That's love for God. That's the source from which we serve. Here's the second point. Love for others is that by which we serve. Love for others is that by which we serve. According to our text there in Galatians 5:13-14, we are not to be people of self-indulgence, but a people of benevolence. The text reads, "Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh." That's the negative part. The positive part, "but through love serve one another." So negatively speaking, Paul writes, do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Now, matters of the flesh are actually highlighted in Galatians 5:19 through 21. I mean, there's a list here, the works of the flesh. Winkler breaks these down into three categories. There's purity problems, like adultery, fornication, impurity, sensuality, drunkenness, revelries, and things like that. There is priority problems, idolatry, for instance, people problems, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, envy, murders, and my, oh my, how that has been on the, center stage in our country as of late. I mean, I just read to you a list of things that are considered works of the flesh. And my, there is so much of that in our world. Paul says you don't use this freedom you have to live like that. All of those, frankly, are barriers to service. But positively speaking, Paul says there in Galatians 5, but through love serve one another. The preposition through translates the Greek word dia, which can refer to the means or instrument by which anything is affected. So as used in this text that we're looking at, love is the means or instrument by which we carry out our role as servants. We are moved to help others because of the love that we have for them. So love for God is the arena from which our service originates. And we have the heart of a servant because we love God and we want Him to be honored and we want Him to be glorified. And at the same time, love for others is the agent by which our service operates. Our love for God gives us the mindset of a servant, and our love for others puts that mindset into motion, we might say. So there's just a couple of truths about service that get at why we're doing things and what should attend our service. And love is definitely at the heart of that. Here, what I want to do is we transition to think about just some practical things, okay, in terms of cultivating the discipline of service. I want to share with you some words from a man by the name of Francis de Sales. He writes, occasions are seldom presented for the exercise of fortitude, magnanimity. Man, I practiced this word so much, and I couldn't get it out that time. It's one of the hardest words to say, in my humble opinion. Magnificence, let's move on. But meekness, temperance, modesty, and humility are virtues wherewith all the actions of our life should be tempered. It is true there are other virtues more agreeable, but the use of these is more necessary. Sugar is more agreeable than salt, but the use of salt is more necessary in general. Therefore, we must constantly have a good store of these general virtues in readiness, since we stand in need of them almost continually. So outside of butchering that one word up there, you might be wondering, what in the world is this guy, trying to say? Well, he is comparing the great virtues, which he looks at as like fortitude. These, let's put it in terms of service, these services like martyrdom, these just magnificent, grand displays of service in some way or another. He's kind of comparing those with some of these smaller fidelities, and he compares these two things to sugar and salt. So for him, sugar, has a more exquisite taste. Its use is less frequent. Salt is found everywhere, And so the great virtues, as he's telling, these, we might say, great acts of service are a rare occurrence. They're more like sugar, as his comparison goes. And the ministry of the small things is more like salt. Richard Foster, he writes, he says, large tasks require great sacrifice for a moment. Small things, he says, requires constant sacrifice. So the point I'm making is the service suggestions that I am going to give are more salt than sugar. These are the services that can be rendered on a daily or weekly basis by attending to the small, seemingly insignificant things. Okay? I mean, sure. We can ask questions about whether or not God, whether or not in a situation where we perhaps have to die for our faith and serve God in that way, or serve as an example to others of our willingness to endure whatever, even death, because of our allegiance to Christ. Those things are not necessarily presented to everybody in a lifetime. There have been a lot of Christians who have lived and died who were not put into that kind of situation. Of course, there are groups or folks along the way that said, well, if you're a true Christian, you'll find a way to get in that situation. But there are these things we're called to on a daily basis that we could do in service to others that are not, quote unquote big, but are quote unquote small. But that doesn't mean they're not important. So I'm going to give you 5 of these. And again, this will get you thinking perhaps. I like when you're presented with something, you go, I have never really considered that to be a service to somebody else. But you know what? It is. So here's the first one, okay? Some service in the small things. How about being courteous to others? We must never despise common courtesies, those sort of rituals of relationship that are in every culture. It is one of the few ways arguably left in modern society to acknowledge the value of one another. According to Paul in Titus 3:2, we are to be gentle and to show perfect courtesy toward all men. Acknowledging others through, at least in a pandemic, hand waves and fist and elbow bumps. And a non-pandemic era, we would, shake hands and maybe even hug, right? Saying thank you and yes, please. Opening or holding a door for someone. Writing letters of appreciation, RSVPing responses. They're all services of courtesy. The specific acts will vary in various, some ways from culture to culture, but the purpose is always the same, to acknowledge others, to affirm their worth. The service of courtesy is sorely needed in our increasingly depersonalized society. So here's a little service, okay, in the small things. Something, if you do not view yourself as a particularly courteous person, if somebody says, how are you doing, you're kind of expected to say something in return, right? And I realize they're common, and they seem insignificant, but this is part of our service. Here's a second one, assisting others in simple ways. So I've got just, I put together some examples here. I mean, there are a myriad of ways that we can do this. How about, mowing a lawn, cleaning up a house, cleaning up a yard. You could add into that, repairs, as long as they don't get into, not saying you can't do monumental repairs and, huge things for people, but our focus, again, is on some of the more smaller things where we can serve others. Preparing food, driving someone to a doctor's appointment, running errands for somebody. That can be helpful. A lot of that's been going on during these pandemic days. In his book, Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes, "The second service that one should perform for another in a Christian community is that of active helpfulness. This means initially," he writes, "simple assistance in trifling external matters. There's a multitude of these things wherever people live together. Nobody is too good for the meanest service," Bonhoeffer writes. And then I love this last sentence. Y'all ready? "One who worries about the loss of time that such petty outward acts of helpfulness entail is usually taking the importance of his or her own career too solemnly." And the point is that sometimes, right, many times even, helping others in some of these small ways, like if you had to take somebody from here in Lawrenceburg to the doctor's office in Franklin or Nashville, well, you're looking at about a 3-hour round trip, even if you don't stay at the hospital very long. If you, by some miracle, have a very brief visit and get in about as soon as you get there, right? And so time can be lost. Maybe you do this for someone reluctantly, right? You're like, they need me to do it. I'm going to do it. I really don't want to, or I don't have the time to. Or we get sort of, a bit anxious about the time that it's taking. One who worries, Bonhoeffer says, about the loss of time is usually taking the importance of his own career too solemnly. I thought that was brilliant and very much challenging. Here's the third thing, practicing hospitality. In Romans 12:13, Paul writes, "Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality." Similarly, Peter, this is in 1 Peter 4:9, says, "Show hospitality to one another without grumbling." Now, I realize that our opportunities for practicing hospitality are limited during a pandemic, but it's still worth emphasizing. Also realize that there may be some differences between the first century and now, though I've recently read some interesting perspectives on this. What I mean is, today we have some really nice hotels. Here in Lawrenceburg, that Best Western Plus out there looks pretty nice, to be honest. I mean, I'm going to, a lot of folks are going to want to stay there when they come to Lawrenceburg and for any length of time from out of town. And so the need to show hospitality, to bring people into your home, is not as necessarily common today in these parts of the world as they would have been in other parts of the world now or in the first century, where maybe you didn't really have the luxury in a certain locality of going to an inn. And even then you may not want to go to it because of its reputation or in times cost or whatever. And so there was the need for practicing hospitality, just to give lodging to itinerant preachers and missionaries and things of that nature. But let me just say here that, sometimes when we think of hospitality, we think that we got to be the perfect host or hostess, that every single room in the house has got to be in tip-top shape. Maybe it would be good for us to think in terms of formal hospitality and informal hospitality. And by the way, before this leaves me, one of the thoughts that came across in one of the one of the books I was reading, he was like, it may be that, he said that we should go out of our way to displace the hotel industry in our use of hospitality, that we should insist that people who are coming from out of town that we know are connected to the church in some way or stay with us in our homes as opposed to a hotel. That's probably going a little too far. But when I think about formal and informal hospitality, on the formal side of things, I think about those that are going to be coming, staying with you for a while, and you got to have certain amenities in place, and you got to have room for them. But that's the more formal hospitality, I should say. The informal is somebody, bringing somebody over to eat a dinner and just to visit with you for a couple hours or something, where you can kind of entertain guests in that way for briefer periods of time, but a chance to connect in your home and practice hospitality in an uncomplicated way. Those formal, hospitable moments may be, far and few between, but perhaps some of these more informal moments need an uptick in our lives and in our church families, especially as we crawl out of the pandemic. There's obviously concerns that folks have right now, but it's worth mentioning. Here's a fourth thing, listening to others. Have you thought about this and the importance of listening, like really listening to others as a service to them? I'm returning to that book, Life Together by Bonhoeffer. So he said the second service was this, you might have recalled, he said the second service is this act of helpfulness. Here he says the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them. And he writes, just as love to God begins with listening to his word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. Now, we do not have to be trained counselors to listen well. We don't even have to have all the answers to listen well. We need to become more anxious about listening than we do about answering. An impatient half listening is an affront to the person that's sharing. The service of listening cannot be underestimated. So you're like, how do I serve? One of the things you might find, these are things I'm already doing. Sometimes we just think, I'm not serving anybody. What grand thing do I need to start doing in order to feel good about myself in terms of service? Have I actually made service a holy habit? I don't know. Have you? Some of these things are service. These are service-oriented things. And so listening to others, being a confidant, and someone who is willing to weep with those who weep, or rejoice with those who rejoice. Here's a fifth one. These are all, I think, I just wanted to share some things that, on the whole, that don't necessarily require, conquering the world. Here's a fifth way, guarding the reputation of others. Have you ever thought about this as a service to other people? Paul, he taught us to speak evil of no one. Gossip, backbiting, slander, all of that stuff is condemned in both Testaments. Now, we may clothe our backbiting in all the religious respectability we want, but it will always remain a deadly poison. We should avoid, as much as possible, being party to the slanderous talk of others. And that is hard. You can get in certain groups. I think of one sermon I preached, and that's been several years back, entitled Perilous Powwows. We get in groups. Maybe it's the guys all getting together, or the ladies getting together in some group, and man, it's amazing the kinds of discussions that can ensue. And then we are here, somebody's reputation perhaps is being dragged through the mud. Maybe it's in the workplace, or maybe at school, among your friends and your peers, and you become party to it rather than guarding the reputation of other human beings. And so that is a lasting service to others, is to avoid those kinds of things, the way that we speak of others, or the way that we allow others to speak about others in our presence. How we handle those situations can take on the form of a service to another person. It's interesting. There's other things that we could discuss, but here's just some things that can be practiced on a daily, weekly basis, even monthly at the longest, that will all, I think, help cultivate a servant mindedness, a heart of service, disciplining yourself for service could take this form, or these forms, we might say. I want to close this lesson by thinking about this last thought here. Serving others can sometimes be exhausting, but it is always enduring. Paul wrote in Ephesians 4:12 about the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. Sometimes serving others is nothing less than hard work. It can be difficult. It can be taxing. In another passage, Paul described his service to God and others as follows: "For this I toil, struggling with all his energy that he powerfully works within me." The word toil means to work to the point of exhaustion, while from the Greek word translated struggling comes our word agonize. Like Paul, sometimes our service will be agonizing, exhausting. It will take our time. It may even require our resources. It will often prove maybe more stressful, less enjoyable than other ways that we could invest our lives. And even though this is the case, even though serving God and serving others is work, there is no work that is more gratifying, and there is no work that is more enduring. Unlike some things that we might do in this life, service to God and others is never valueless. Now, the same Paul who agonized to the point of exhaustion while serving God reminded us in 1 Corinthians 15:58. He says, "Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." Even if we can't see the proof for one reason or another, our service to God is never, ever in vain. God sees, God knows all of our service to Him and others, and He will never forget it. And He will reward us in heaven for it, because He is faithful and He is just. I love Hebrews 6:10. Here's what it reads: "For God is not unjust, so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for His name in serving the saints as you still do. Notice, he is not unjust to overlook your work and your love in all of your service to the saints and non-saints. Disciplined service to God can sometimes be exhausting, but it is the kind of work that will endure for all eternity. And so, I don't know, that sounds like some pretty good motivation for giving ourselves to the discipline of service. To see to it that we are looking for ways to serve other people. So, hey, thanks for your attention again, for listening in on this. And come next week. As I see it, I think we've only got about 3 lessons left, and then we'll be moving on to something else. But we will have, I think, covered, in my opinion, a lot of really good material that should be able to help us in our own spiritual lives. And, kind of grabbing the bull by the horns, as it were, and taking responsibility for our spiritual lives and implementing these disciplines, making them second nature, all of which will help us become more like Jesus Christ. So again, thanks for watching, and have a good week. May God bless you.